Thăng kiểm tra toàn bộ
find
What
me
the
in
Dead
my
Built.
bag.
Bài kết quả kiểm tra. Lỗi nghiêm trọng. Lỗi một tên nhân vật từ bản gốc bị rò rỉ vào Part 2. Trong cảnh vault ngân hàng Part 2, Eleanor nói, Harold built this, she said. She meant Walter. She caught herself. Không có nhân vật nào tên Harold trong câu chuyện này. Đây là tên từ bản gốc bị sót lại lỗi nghiêm trọng nhất trong toàn bộ truyện. Lỗi hại twist 5 không được thực hiện đúng. Outline quy định Raymond phát hiện đó là bán sau mỉm cười và từng đòn phản công Dark Web Auction 48 giờ. Trong bản viết, Raymond cầm USB vào laptop, gật đầu hài lòng và rời đi như thế không có gì. Twist 5 cú phản công của Holt hoàn toàn biến mất. Đây là mất đi một beat căng thẳng lớn nhất của toàn truyện. Lối 3 climax xảy ra ngoài màn hình Holt bị bắt nhưng khán giả không được xem. Marsh kể lại tại tiệc cười rằng Holt was taken on Virginia Street 40 minutes after he left you. Một villain được xây dựng suốt 3 phần bị bắt bằng. Một câu kể lại tại tiệc cưới. Đây là anti-climax nghiêm trọng đặc biệt với khán giả 65 cộng cận sự thỏa mãn cảm xúc trong giải quyết xung đột. Lỗi nhỏ. Lỗi bọn cấu trúc từ kind of lập quá dày trong Part 1 đếm được 11 lần dùng cấu trúc này trong Part 1. Đây là dấu hiệu của văn xuôi bị phụ thuộc vào một công thức. Lỗi 5 chuyển cảnh Part 2 thiếu nhịp từ cảnh 4 giờ sáng tại Diner đến 3 ngày ẩn náu tại nhà June. Không có câu chuyện. Thời gian nhảy đột ngột. Kiểm tra nhân vật. Nhân vật. Tên. Tuổi. Giới tính. Nhất quán. Mason Cole. 65 ẩn nam. Ethan Cole. 40 nam. Eleanor Voss. 73 Noah True Harold Slip. Raymond Holt. 58 nam Jessica Harmon. 63 nam June Calloway. 50 Inu Vivian. 38 Inu Agent Marsh. 52 Inu Kim Tra Bay Twist. Twist trạng thái thứ 1, chiếc nhẫn cười đúng vị trí hiệu quả thứ 2, tâm thiếp có chú ý đúng vị trí cảm xúc tốt. T3 Walter là FBI informant. Đúng vị trí. T4 Raymond là cứu FBI. Đúng vị trí. T5 Raymond biết là bạn sao. Thiếu Raymond chấp nhận như bạn thật. Thế sau bay của người đã chết. Có nhưng kể lại không on screen. T7 kẻ phản bội trong Iron Wolf. Đúng vị trí ambiguity tốt. Bị kẻ đã. Điểm số bay phây 5 trên 10. Dưới 9 phây 5 mũi tên cạnh sửa. Phần cần viết lại đoạn cuối Part 2 từ cảnh vault ngân hàng và đầu Part 3 đến hết cảnh giải cứu Ethan. Thăng phần sửa thay thế đoạn cuối Part 2 và đầu Part 3. Thay thế to Wells Fargo opened its doors at 9 o'clock. Đến hết Part 2 và to đầu Part 3 đến hết cảnh giải cứu Ethan. Wells Fargo opened its doors at 9 o'clock with the muted efficiency of a Sunday morning operation, half-staffed and unhurried. The lobby was high-ceilinged and sun-filled, which seemed faintly insulting given the circumstances. A young woman at the customer service desk looked up when Mason and Eleanor came through the door, took in Eleanor's composure and Mason's presence, and the particular quality of the silence between them, and had the good professional instincts to ask only what they needed without asking anything else. Safety deposit box. 847, under Walter Voss. Eleanor produced the key and signed the access log with a hand that was steadier than Mason expected. The clerk led them through the lobby and down a short corridor to the vault room, a space that smelled of temperature-controlled air, an old metal-lined floor-to-ceiling with numbered doors behind which sat the private accumulated weight of other people's lives. Box 847 was in the third row. Eleanor unlocked it. She lifted it out herself, declining with a small motion the assistance Mason offered, and set it on the narrow examination table along the wall. She stood looking at it for a moment. Her hand rested on the lid. He understood what she was doing. He did not hurry her. She was saying something to Walter. Whatever it was private, and Mason looked at the wall and let her have it. Then she opened the box. Inside was a manila envelope, sealed with Eleanor's name written on the outside, in the careful printing of a man who had always taken care with the things that mattered. She lifted it out with both hands. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she handed it to Mason. He opened it. The USB drive was small and black and unremarkable, the kind of thing you would find in a drawer without remembering where it came from. Beneath it was a letter, 2 pages handwritten on yellow legal paper, in the same careful printing as the envelope. Eleanor reached past him and took the letter. She read it standing there in the vault room, and Mason watched her face change as she read. Watched something break open behind her eyes and then reform into something else, something harder and quieter and altogether different from grief, though grief was part of it. When she finished, she folded the letter along its original creases and held it against her chest for a moment. Her eyes were closed. Her lips moved slightly, not in speech, in something older than speech. Then she opened her eyes. She looked at Mason. He knew, she said. He knew they might find him before July 23rd. He wrote this 8 months ago. She looked down at the folded pages. He said he had left something with the FBI already, separate from this. He said this was in case things went wrong and I needed proof, something I could hold in my hands. Her voice steadied. He said to find Agent Diana Marsh. He said she was the only one in the system he trusted completely. Mason held the USB drive. He stood there in the vault room looking at it and felt the weight of what a man will do when he understands that his time is running out and the work is not finished, when he loves someone enough to plan for their survival across the distance of his own death. "We need to copy it," Mason said. Eleanor looked at him. "We give Holt something," he said, "but not everything." He called Duke. Duke's voice came through calm and immediate. 9 minutes later, in a copy shop 2 blocks from the bank, the files transferred. Duke stood over the machine and watched it himself. He called back when it was done. Mason marked the original with a small scratch on the casing edge, invisible unless you were looking for it. He put the original into his boot. He put the copy into his jacket pocket. Eleanor watched him do this. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He's going to know." Mason looked at her. "Walter documented everything for 23 months, she said. "The man who is waiting outside has been hunting us for 5 months. He has resources we don't have." Her voice was even. "He will have a way to verify." "Maybe," Mason said, "but we have to try." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the particular resolution of a woman who had run out of better options and had decided that insufficient options were still options. They walked back out into the Sunday morning. Holt was waiting exactly where they had left him. He watched Mason cross the road with the patience of a man who had not for a single moment doubted this outcome. Mason held out the copy. Holt looked at it. He took it between 2 fingers and handed it without a word to the young man beside him, who had a laptop open on the hood of the nearest SUV. The man inserted the drive. His fingers moved across the keyboard. His eyes tracked the screen. 30 seconds. 45. Then the young man looked up at Holt and gave the smallest possible nod. Holt smiled. It was a different smile than Mason had seen before. Not the controlled corporate expression from the diner, not the cold satisfaction of a man getting what he came for. This one was something else, something that had patience in it. The smile of a man who has been 3 steps ahead and is now watching everyone else arrive at the step he left 3 moves ago. "Copy," Holt said. The word landed in the Sunday morning air like a stone dropped into still water. Mason did not move. "Good copy," Holt continued. His voice was almost conversational. "Your club president moves quickly. The file structure is identical. The metadata timestamps match within acceptable variance, and the total byte count is accurate to within 0.02%. He tilted his head slightly, but the hash values are off by 11 characters, which means this drive has been written once, not accumulated over 23 months, which means it's a duplicate." He paused. "I'd have been disappointed if you hadn't tried." The street was very quiet. Holt reached into his jacket and produced his own phone. He turned the screen toward Mason. It showed what appeared to be an online interface, a dark background, a countdown timer in white numerals. 47 hours, 31 minutes, and some seconds running backward. 3 days ago, Holt said, the original contents of Box 847 were uploaded to a private server, encrypted, distributed, beyond the reach of any federal warrant currently in existence. He let this settle. When that timer reaches 0, the files go to auction. The buyers have already been identified. They have a significant personal interest in the names on Walter Voss's lists. He looked at Eleanor. "I think you understand what that means for the people on those lists." Eleanor had gone very still. "The only thing that stops the auction," Holt said, "is a code that exists on a single device that I carry, which I will enter when Mrs. Voss accompanies me off this street." He spread his hands in a gesture of regrettable necessity. "I'm not unreasonable. She comes with me. The auction stops. Everyone else goes home." Eleanor took 1 step forward. Mason put his arm across in front of her. "No," he said. "Mason." Her voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "He'll kill you. He'll kill all of you. And those names on Walter's list." "No," Mason said again, not loud, not theatrical, the way you say something when it is the only word available. He looked at Holt. Holt looked back at him with the expression of a man who has arranged everything carefully and is waiting for the last piece to fall into its designated place. Mason reached into his jacket. He pulled out his phone. Holt's men shifted slightly, a small collective adjustment, the readiness of trained people registering an unexpected movement. But Mason only brought the phone to his ear. "Duke," he said, "call Marsh right now. Tell her Holt is on Santini Street, half a block east of Virginia. Tell her he has a device with a countdown and she needs to move." Holt's expression changed. Not much. The control held. but something recalculated behind his eyes, something that had been certain one moment and was less certain the next. "That won't help you," Holt said. "The server is—" "Duke." Mason kept his eyes on Holt. "Make the call." He lowered the phone. The two men stood in the Sunday morning and looked at each other, and neither spoke, and the countdown on Holt's phone ran backward through its numerals, with the indifference of machines. And somewhere in the city, a phone was ringing in an FBI field office on Sierra Street. 40 seconds passed. Then Mason's phone buzzed. He answered it. Agent Marsh's voice came through without preamble. "Mr. Cole, tell Holt that Walter Voss submitted encrypted file uploads to this office every week for 23 months. We received the last one 6 days before he died. The files on that server were verified and processed 8 weeks ago. The case closed 2 weeks ago." A pause. "The auction has no buyers. We've been in contact with every identified party on the list for the past month. We were waiting for Holt to surface." Mason lowered the phone. He looked at Raymond Holt. "Walter uploaded everything," and he said, "every week for 23 months. You've been chasing a USB drive. That was never the point." He watched Holt's face work through this. "The case closed 2 weeks ago. They've been waiting for you." For the first time, something moved in Raymond Holt's face that was not control. It was brief. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But it was there, the expression of a man who has been 14 steps ahead for 5 months, realizing in a single moment of clarity that the man he had been running against had been dead for 5 months and had still outplayed him. Then the federal vehicles came around the corner. 3 of them black SUVs, not unlike Holt's own, moving with the calm speed of people who had been in position for the last 40 minutes waiting for a signal. They blocked both ends of the street simultaneously. Men and women in FBI vests came out of them in the organized sequence of a rehearsed operation. Holt's own men did the math very quickly. They put their hands up. Holt stood completely still as an agent approached him from behind. The handcuffs went on with a mechanical click that was very small in the open air, but carried a long distance in the quiet of the morning. Mason watched Raymond Holt's face as the agent read him his rights. The control was still there, some version of it. The professional composure of a man who had spent 30 years cultivating an appearance of certainty and had not yet found the moment to put it down. But the eyes were doing something different now. They were looking at the middle distance, at something that Mason recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror for years. The expression of a man accounting for what he had chosen and what it had cost. Mason turned to Eleanor. She was standing very still on the sidewalk. Her hands were pressed together in front of her, not in prayer exactly, but in the way hands come together, when a person needs to feel themselves contained, when the size of the moment is larger than the body knows how to manage. Marsh crossed the street toward them. She stopped in front of Eleanor. "Your husband submitted his last file upload on July 14th, she said. 6 days before he died. It completed the chain of evidence. Everything we needed." She held Eleanor's gaze. He knew he was running out of time. He spent the last 6 days of his life making sure the work was finished. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He didn't tell me?" "No," Marsh said. "He wouldn't have. He was protecting you from knowing how close it was." A pause. He was a precise man. He knew exactly what he was doing. Holt was being walked to a federal vehicle across the street. He did not look back. Mason watched him go. Duke came up beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He said nothing. He watched Holt get into the vehicle. He watched the door close. Then he said, "Your boy." "Yeah," Mason said. He turned to Marsh. "Industrial Road. Old Pinnacle Warehouse, East End. Holt told me he'd be there alive." "We have a team 4 minutes out," Marsh said. She was already reaching for her radio. "Go." What the Dead Built, Part 3, What the Dead Built. The warehouse on Industrial Road was exactly where Holt had said it would be. Mason came off his bike before the engine died, moving with a speed that lived somewhere below thought, and Duke was 2 steps behind him, and the side door went in with one kick because the frame was old and the rust had already done most of the work. The interior was vast and cold. Thin winter light came down from high windows that had lost most of their glass to time and weather. The floor was bare concrete with the ghosts of old machinery prints in the dust. The smell was metal and cold air, and something faintly chemical underneath the smell of a space that had been used for purposes it was not built for. In the center of the floor, a wooden chair. Ethan was in it. He had managed in the time since the tablet footage to work his left wrist partially free. His head was down when the door went in. It came up when he heard Mason's boots on the concrete. He saw his father crossing the floor toward him. Mason dropped to one knee in front of the chair and got his hands on the bindings and worked them loose. And when Ethan's hands came free, they went immediately to his father's shoulders and held there, not with the tentative care of someone uncertain of his welcome, but with the force of someone who had been in that chair for 2 hours, deciding what it would feel like to get out of it. Mason put his arms around his son. He felt Ethan's breathing against his shoulder, ragged at first, then steadying, the particular way a person breathes when they have been holding themselves together by pure will and have finally found something solid enough to let go against. Duke stood at the door with his back to the room and gave them whatever time they needed. After a while, Mason pulled back and looked at his son's face. The left eye was bad. The cut along the jaw had stopped bleeding on its own. There was bruising along the right cheekbone and on the left side of the rib cage, which Mason could tell from the careful way Ethan was holding himself. Ribs, Mason said. Maybe one, breathing's fine. Hospital. Wedding. Ethan put one hand on the back of the chair and pushed himself to his feet. He swayed once and found his balance. What time is it? 9:48. Wedding starts at 11. He looked at Mason with absolute clarity. I did not sit in that chair for 2 hours to miss my own wedding. Help me to the bike. Mason looked at his son for a long moment. He thought about Claire, about the particular quality of stubbornness that had made her the most maddening and most necessary person he had ever known. The way she pursued the things she had decided mattered with a completeness that made argument feel not just futile, but beside the point. He had missed it for 24 years. He was not going to argue with it now. Duke, he said. Duke turned around. We need someone to call ahead to St. Michael's Cathedral. Tell the priest the groom is running approximately 30 minutes behind and will explain everything in the confessional at a later date. Duke looked at Ethan at the swollen eye and the torn shirt and the careful posture of a man managing a cracked rib and took out his phone without comment. They got on the bikes. The sun came up over Nevada the way it always did in late November, without apology and without warmth. A flat white disk that turned the desert pale and made the mountains to the west look like they'd been cut from cardboard and pasted against the sky. Eleanor Voss had fallen asleep in the corner booth sometime around 3 in the morning. She was small in sleep, her hands folded on the table, her white hair still faintly damp, her breathing the slow and careful rhythm of someone who had finally, after a very long time, found a few hours of safety. June had put a folded tablecloth over her shoulders. It was not a blanket, but it was what the diner had. Mason sat across the room and watched the dawn come through the windows and did not sleep at all. Ethan sat across from him. They had talked through most of the night, not steadily, not easily, but the way two people talk when there is too much to say, and no established path through it in pieces and quiet stretches, in the occasional sentence that landed somewhere important and was left to sit there without being examined too closely. There was no resolution in it. Mason did not expect resolution. He was 65 years old and he had learned mostly through damage that resolution was not the goal. Presence was the goal. Staying at the table was the goal. Ethan had told him about Vivian. They had met 4 years ago through colleagues. She was a landscape architect, thoughtful and precise with a dry sense of humor that had taken Ethan 3 months to fully calibrate to. They had been together for 2 years before he proposed. The wedding had been planned for 8 months. Her family was from Vermont and had opinions about ceremony that Ethan had described with the carefully neutral language of a man who had learned to pick his battles. Then he said the other thing. He said it quietly, looking at his coffee rather than at Mason in the same tone he might use to mention a change in weather. Vivian's pregnant, he said. About 3 months. Mason looked at his son. He felt the news move through him like a current, something electric and slow, at the same time touching everything it passed. A boy or a girl, he asked. Too early to know. Ethan looked up. Something in his face was careful testing. You're going to be a grandfather. Mason did not say anything for a moment. He thought about Claire. He thought about the way she had looked the morning they brought Ethan home from the hospital, sitting in the passenger seat of the truck with the baby in her arms, not trusting the car seat for a drive of less than 3 blocks, her face doing something he had never seen it do before. Something open and terrified and completely certain all at once. He thought about the 24 years that had passed since she died. He thought about how long he had been a ghost in his own son's life, present only as a story that got harder to tell every year. Yeah, Mason said. His voice came out roughly. Yeah, I am. Ethan nodded, not with warmth yet, but without coldness. It was the nod of a man who was making a decision about what came next, who was weighing something against something else, and had not finished weighing it but had decided to proceed anyway. Vivian wants to meet you, Ethan said. She said that before we left for Reno. She said whatever happened between us, she wanted you at the wedding. She was the one who convinced me to send the invitation at all. Mason sat with that. She sounds like her mother, he said finally. Ethan looked at him. Claire, Mason said. She was the one who always knew what the right thing was, even when it cost her something to do it. They were quiet for a long time after that. Eleanor woke at 7. She woke the way old women who have survived difficult things sometimes wake fully and immediately without the soft transition of gradual consciousness present before she had opened her eyes all the way, already scanning the room. Then she saw Mason at the counter talking to Duke and June behind the coffee machine, and the quiet normality of the diner in morning light, and something in her settled. She sat up and folded the tablecloth carefully the way she would have folded a blanket in her own home. Duke brought coffee. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at Mason across the counter. He came over and sat across from her. Ethan sat at the end of the booth, giving them the table but staying close. "Tell me the rest of it," Mason said. "All of it. Not the version you told the sheriff." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She had the eyes of someone who had spent her whole life as a school teacher, someone accustomed to reading a room, to knowing which students were paying attention and which ones were performing attention. She read Mason Cole and appeared to find what she was looking for. She started talking. Walter Voss had worked as a senior accountant for Pinnacle Group for 22 years. Not a glamorous career. He drove a 12-year-old Buick and brought his lunch in a Tupperware container and had never once complained about any of it because the work was steady and the benefits were good, and it had put their daughter through 2 years of college before the accident on Route 93 had ended that particular future. He was meticulous. He was patient. He had the kind of mind that found comfort in the precision of numbers, in the way columns balanced and reconciled, in the quiet satisfaction of a ledger that told the truth. In the spring of the previous year, the ledger stopped telling the truth. It was subtle at first. Small irregularities in property acquisition records, payments routed through shell companies with addresses that did not correspond to any real entity, depreciation figures that made sense on paper, only if you already knew they were designed to obscure something rather than reveal it. Walter had flagged 3 discrepancies internally in March and had been told by his supervisor that the accounts in question had already been reviewed and cleared. The supervisor had smiled when he said it. Walter had gone home that evening and sat in the kitchen for an hour without turning on the lights. He had started keeping records of his own. He used a notebook at first, then a USB drive, then a second USB drive kept separately, then began emailing encrypted files to an account Eleanor did not know about. He did not tell her why. He told her there were irregularities at work, things he was looking into, and asked her to let him handle it quietly. She had agreed not because she was passive, but because she had been married to Walter Voss for 50 years, and she knew the difference between the face he made when he was worried and the face he made when he was frightened. By June, he was frightened. In late June, a man came to the house, not Raymond Holt, a younger man professionally dressed who identified himself as being with the federal government and asked to speak with Walter privately. Walter had gone outside with him for 45 minutes. He came back in and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, which he almost never drank, and sat at the kitchen table. And when Eleanor asked what that was about, he said, "Something I should have done months ago." He had been approached by the FBI, specifically by an agent named Diana Marsh, who worked financial crimes out of the Reno field office and had been tracking irregularities in Pinnacle Group's Nevada real estate portfolio for 18 months. Walter was not her first contact inside the company, but he was, she told him, the most thorough. He had documented transactions that her own analysts had not been able to locate. He had built from inside the company using nothing but access and patience and a meticulous mind, a record of 15 years of money laundering that moved $340 million through fabricated property deals and hollow corporate structures. The money belonged to a cartel operating out of 3 states. Pinnacle Group was not a real estate company. It was a machine built to make that money invisible. Walter had signed an agreement with the FBI on July 3rd. He had been given a contact protocol, a secondary handler, and a date, July 23rd, the appointed time for his final handover of all compiled evidence. Not his first contact with Marsh's office, but the last scheduled one, the one that would complete the transfer and trigger the federal investigation. He never made it to July 23rd. On the 20th at 3:17 in the morning, his car left Route 93 on the long straight stretch east of Sparks and went into a drainage ditch at a speed the accident report said was consistent with a driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel. Walter had never fallen asleep at the wheel in 40 years of driving. He had never in their marriage fallen asleep in front of the television. Eleanor had gone to identify the body at 8 in the morning. She had seen the bruises on his throat. She had told the responding officer. He had written it down in his notebook and explained that blunt force injuries and rollover accidents were consistent with seatbelt and steering column contact. She knew what she had seen. 2 days after the funeral, the house was broken into. Nothing irreplaceable was taken. Jewelry, a camera, Walter's laptop. The briefcase that had been under his side of the bed for 5 months was gone. His filing cabinet in the study had been opened and several folders removed. 3 weeks later, she found the cameras. Small ones, no larger than a thumb drive, hidden in the smoke detector in the kitchen and behind the bathroom mirror and in the lamp in the bedroom. She had stood in the bathroom and looked at the mirror for a long time, And then she had gone back to the kitchen and sat very still at the table where she and Walter had eaten 50 years of meals together, and she had understood that the people who had killed her husband were waiting to find out how much she knew. She had packed a bag that night. In the back of the hall closet behind Walter's old winter coats, she had found the letter. He had put it inside their wedding album, wedged behind the back cover, folded twice, sealed with a strip of tape. She had read it standing in the closet with a flashlight because she was afraid to turn on any lights. The letter told her about the Wells Fargo safety deposit box in Reno. Number 847, Walter's name on the account, but registered under their joint access. He had set it up 11 months before he died, before he had ever contacted the FBI, at a time when he was still deciding what to do and was preparing for the possibility that he might not be given enough time to finish deciding. She had been running for 3 weeks. 2 hotels had turned her away from extending her stay without explanation, both within hours of her checking in. A man had followed her on foot through the parking garage in Elko. A car had driven past the house of her friend in Battle Mountain 3 times in one afternoon. She did not know how they tracked her. She did not know whether they had people inside the police departments she had considered approaching. Walter had told her once that Pinnacle's reach went further than she would expect, that the money touched more official hands than would be comfortable to know. So she ran, and she ended up into the Mile Marker Diner at 10:30 on a Thursday night, soaking wet and alone, and with nowhere left to go. She looked at Mason when she finished. Walter told me, she said that if anything happened to him, I should trust my instincts. He said I had better instincts than I gave myself credit for. She looked down at the mug. I don't know why I walked to your booth. You looked like the most dangerous person in the room. Usually am, Mason said. That's exactly why. She looked up. Dangerous men don't frighten when someone threatens them. Safe men do. I needed someone who wouldn't frighten. Duke, who had been leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, said nothing. But something in his face acknowledged what she had said. June lived 10 miles east of the diner on a county road that had never been properly paved and probably never would be. The house was a single-story tan stucco, set back from the road behind 2 old cottonwoods, whose bare November branches spread across the yard like the arms of something large and unhurried. There was a barn that wasn't used as a barn anymore, and a good fence and sightlines in 3 directions that Duke approved of without commenting directly. Eleanor took the guest room. June's daughter, Nora, 14, with her mother's auburn hair and the watchful eyes of a child who had grown up in a house with one adult, accepted the presence of an elderly woman, 6 motorcycles parked in her driveway, and her mother's careful neutrality about all of it, with the particular adaptability of teenagers who have learned that the world is stranger than advertised. Ethan drove back to Reno on Friday morning. He had to pick up his tuxedo. He had to meet with the priest. He had Vivian, who had been patient and trusting through a phone call at 1 in the morning and a 2-hour absence, and a return that had clearly shaken him in ways he was not yet ready to fully articulate. Before he left, he stood in the driveway with Mason for a few minutes, the 2 of them in the cold morning air, and what passed between them was not a conversation exactly. It was the acknowledgement that something had shifted, some weight redistributed, not removed, nothing as clean as that, but moved to a different place. Sunday, Ethan said. Bank opens at 9, wedding starts at 11. The bank is 20 minutes from St. Michael's. I told you I wasn't coming to the wedding. I know what you told me. Ethan opened his car door. I'm telling you to come anyway. He drove away before Mason could respond. The days between Thursday night and Sunday morning had a quality that Mason recognized from other waiting periods in his life, the hours before something you cannot stop is about to happen, where time feels both too slow and already past. He spent most of Friday morning in June's barn, which had become a staging point of sorts, with Duke's people coming and going in 2-hour rotations, always 2 riders watching the county road, always one inside. The system was efficient and quiet and drew no attention from the road. Duke came in from a call on Friday afternoon and sat on an overturned bucket and rubbed the back of his neck. Raymond Holt, he said. Mason looked up from the carburetor he'd been cleaning out of habit because having something in his hands helped him think. One of the brothers works site management for a mid-sized contractor out of Carson City, Duke said. He made some calls. Holt came up in a conversation about Pinnacle Group's construction permits. He paused. The man's not what he says he is. He's not a corporate fixer. He's a former federal agent. Mason put down the carburetor. Duke told him what the calls had turned up. Raymond Holt had worked financial crimes for the FBI for 14 years. He had been considered by most accounts one of the better agents in the Western region, methodical and patient, and genuinely effective against complex financial fraud. Then 12 years ago, an internal affairs investigation had been opened against him. The details were sealed, but the outcome was not. Holt had been quietly separated from the Bureau, his records flagged in ways that were technically available to anyone with the right clearance, but practically invisible without knowing to look for them. He knew the FBI's protocols from the inside. He knew how evidence chains were built and where they were fragile. He knew which field offices communicated with which and which agents were unlikely to coordinate with others, and how long a federal case of that complexity would take to reach indictment from the moment the evidence cleared. He had known from the start exactly how much time he had, and he had known something else. Walter asked for Marsh specifically, Mason said. Named her in his agreement, Duke confirmed. Didn't go through the general intake, requested her by name and badge number through a private attorney, never used Pinnacle's internal communication to do it. He looked at Mason. He knew the regular channels weren't safe, because Holt had someone inside. Has, present tense. Duke picked up the carburetor and turned it over in his hands. Someone in the Reno field office ran a search on Eleanor Voss 3 days before Walter's accident. That search was cleared at a level that doesn't correspond to any active investigation with her name in it. Mason was quiet for a moment. Walter knew the evidence would outlive him, he said. That's why he built the safety deposit box 11 months before he died. He wasn't preparing for a handoff. He was preparing for the possibility that the handoff never happened. Duke set the carburetor down. Man knew what he was doing, he said. It was not a simple statement. It was something closer to respect for a dead stranger, which was its own kind of thing. On Saturday evening, June made dinner for the house. It was a practical meal, the kind of meal produced without ceremony. Roast chicken and potatoes and green beans from a can that no one complained about, and they ate together at the long kitchen table. All of them, Eleanor and June, and Nora, and Mason, and 2 of the Iron Wolf riders who were on house rotation, both of them large, quiet men who ate without speaking and cleared their plates without being asked. After dinner, Nora sat at the counter doing homework, and June washed dishes, and Eleanor fell asleep in the armchair in the front room with the television on low. The riders went back outside, and Mason sat at the kitchen table alone. He had Eleanor's story in his head. He had the shape of it, the weight of it, the particular loneliness of a woman who had spent 5 months running from the people who had murdered her husband with no one to run toward. He thought about Walter Voss building his case in secret, driving home in the dark, sitting in the kitchen without turning on the lights. He thought about what it cost a man to carry something like that alone, to come home every evening to the person he loved most, and say nothing because saying something would put her in the same danger he was already in. He understood that. He understood the particular calculus of it. He was sitting alone at June Calloway's kitchen table on a Saturday night, and he pulled from his jacket pocket the thing Eleanor had shown them all the first morning at the diner. Walter's watch. She had given it to him to hold for the day, for reasons she had not fully explained, only said that she felt better with him holding it, which he had not questioned, because it seemed to make sense in the particular way that things make sense when they are true rather than logical. It was a pocket watch, silver-old, with an ornate case cover that was worn smooth at the edges where a thumb had opened it 10,000 times. The chain was tarnished. The crystal over the face had a hairline crack running from 7 o'clock to 10. He opened it. The hands were stopped at 3:17. The face was cream-colored with thin black numerals, and 2 hands that had not moved since the morning a man went off of Route 93 and did not come back. Eleanor wound it every day. The mechanism was intact, she said. There was no mechanical reason for it not to run. It simply did not. Mason looked at those 2 stopped hands for a long time. He thought about the question he had been carrying since Thursday night and had not yet found the shape to ask it even to himself. He had come to Reno to watch his son get married from the outside. He had gotten pulled into a situation that was not his, that belonged to a woman he had never met, and a dead man he would never know. And in the process of being pulled into it, he had made a phone call that had brought his son to a roadside diner at 4 in the morning. And now there was something between him and Ethan that had not been there before, fragile and unfinished, but real. He was glad for it. He was grateful for it in a way that felt too large to hold in his chest comfortably. But sitting at that table in the quiet of the house, he turned the watch over in his hands and asked himself the question honestly. Was he doing this because it was right? Or was he doing this because it had become a vehicle for something else? Because Eleanor's crisis had given him a reason to call his son, had given him a context in which to say the things he should have said years ago, had handed him a moment of clarity that he had not earned by any process of his own growth, but had simply stumbled into on a wet highway while riding toward a wedding he was not supposed to attend. Was he using Walter Voss's death to buy himself a second chance? He did not know the answer. He sat with the stopped watch in his hands, and he did not know the answer. And the not knowing sat in him like the carburetor he'd cleaned earlier, all the parts present, the mechanism intact, nothing to indicate why it wouldn't run. Outside, a car passed on the county road, and its headlights swept briefly across the window and moved on. He thought about Claire. He thought about the last thing she had said to him 3 days before the end, when she still had enough clarity to say things. She had taken his hand and held it, which she could barely do by then, her grip almost nothing, and she had said, "Mason, don't disappear." He had not understood it at the time. He had thought she meant, "Don't disappear from my bedside," which he had promised and kept. He had been there at the end. But she had meant afterward. She had known him well enough to know what he would do afterward. She had known he would fall into himself. She had known Ethan would need him and he would not be there. She had said the only thing she had time left to say, and he had heard it as a request about the next 3 days rather than a warning about the next 24 years. He thought about this and felt something that was not guilt, exactly, because guilt was something he had made his peace with or tried to. It was something quieter than guilt and older. The understanding that the people who love you see the truest version of what you might become, and that failing that version is not a sin so much as a loss. He put the watch in his pocket. He got up and went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he slept. Sunday morning came in clear and cold. The desert at dawn had a quality that Mason had always thought was something like forgiveness. How the light came sideways across the sage and the sand and made everything look like it had just been set down brand new, the night's accumulations washed off. It was not forgiveness. He knew that, but it looked like it, and sometimes that was enough to get moving. He dressed in clean clothes, dark jeans, a dark button-down shirt. His leather cut the iron wolf patch centered on the back. He had debated the cut for about 30 seconds, then put it on because he had never walked into anything difficult as something other than what he was, and he was not going to start. Eleanor was already up, standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee, wearing the same blue dress she'd had on since Thursday, laundered twice now by June. She looked smaller in the morning light than she had seemed at any other point in the last 3 days. But her eyes, when she turned, were clear. "Ready?" she asked. "You," he said. She considered this genuinely, the way she did most things. "No," she said. But Walter wasn't ready either, and he went anyway. So, Duke had the convoy organized by 8:30. 6 bikes, including Mason's Road King. The plan was straightforward: arrive at Wells Fargo on Virginia Street in Reno at 9 sharp. When the doors opened, access box 847. Retrieve whatever Walter had left, drive directly to the FBI field office on Sierra Street, place the evidence in Agent Marsh's hands, and be done. 20 minutes to the bank, 20 minutes inside, 20 minutes to the FBI office. That left, as Ethan had pointed out, sufficient time to reach St. Michael's Cathedral before the 11 o'clock ceremony. Mason had not agreed to this plan out loud. He rode with Eleanor behind him, her arms around his waist, the way she had ridden for the first time Thursday night, when she had not yet known him well enough to fully trust him, and had held on anyway because there was nothing else to hold. She was lighter than she looked, or he was simply accustomed to her now. They rode east on the county road in the early morning cold, 6 bikes in tight formation, and turned onto Highway 50 heading toward Reno, and for a few miles it was just the road and the sound of the engines and the pale winter desert opening up on both sides, and Mason felt briefly the thing he sometimes felt on a long road early in the morning, a kind of clean emptiness. The particular quality of a moment that has not yet been complicated by events. It lasted until they reached the long curve on the highway 5 miles outside Reno, where the road bent around a rocky outcropping that blocked the sightline to the east. The 2 black SUVs were parked on the shoulder, one on each side of the road, positioned exactly at the apex of the curve, where there was no room to accelerate past them without leaving the asphalt. They had not tried to hide. They were not trying to hide. They had been placed with the deliberate geometry of people who had done this before, and wanted you to understand that they had. Duke's voice came through the headset. "I see them. Stay in formation." Both SUVs pulled onto the highway the moment the motorcycles came through the curve. Not fast, not aggressive, simply they're maintaining a gap of 50 yards, following with the calm confidence of vehicles that had twice the horsepower and 4 times the mass and knew it. They rode that way for 2 miles. Mason kept his eyes forward and his speed steady and felt Eleanor's arms tighten around him. The city limits appeared ahead, buildings rising from the flat desert and traffic thickening, with Sunday morning families heading to church, couples going to breakfast, the ordinary rhythms of a city that did not know it had something playing out on its edges. The SUVs accelerated. They came up from behind with a sudden surge of power and cut in front of the convoy in a coordinated maneuver, both vehicles braking hard and sideways at the same time in the middle of the road, the kind of coordinated stop that required practice, that required the 2 drivers to have done this before and to trust each other completely. Duke swerved left. The rider beside him went right. Mason pulled hard to the outside, his Harley going up a curb before he corrected it, and Eleanor made a sound, not a scream, a short, sharp intake of breath, and held on tighter. And he felt her do it, felt the deliberate choice in the way she gripped him, the decision not to let go. Men were coming out of the SUVs before the vehicles had fully stopped. 8 of them. Dark jackets, the same blank professional stillness, and moving with the practiced coordination of people who had trained together. They spread across the road in a way that was efficient and calm and covered the exits without appearing to. Raymond Holt stood in the center of it all. He looked different in daylight. The gray suit was the same, but he wore it differently out here without the forced cordiality of the diner. The polished corporate manner was still technically present, like a coat he had not yet taken off, but beneath it something else was visible now. Something patient and certain that had nothing to do with manners. He looked at Mason across the width of the road. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he looked at Mason again, and what was in his face was not triumph exactly. It was satisfaction, the particular expression of a man who has been doing complex work for a long time and has arrived at the moment when all the components he has been moving into position finally lock into place. "Mrs. Voss," he said, his voice carried in the cold morning air with no effort. "This has gone on long enough. Whatever you've found, whatever your husband left for you, it doesn't change anything. Give it to me now, and this ends here." Eleanor's hands on Mason's waist did not loosen. Holt raised the tablet. The screen faced outward. It showed a room, concrete floor, exposed metal beams, thin industrial light from above. A wooden chair in the center, and in the chair wrist bound behind him, head hanging forward before being pulled upright by the camera operator's hand on his collar, was Ethan Cole. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. There was dried blood at the corner of his mouth and a fresh cut along his jaw that had been bleeding recently and not been tended to. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. He was breathing. He was conscious. When his head came up and he looked at the camera, his expression was the one Mason had seen in the photograph in Marsh's office. The one that said he had been frightened and had decided not to show it anymore. Mason looked at the screen. The world narrowed. There was the screen and his son's face on it, and the sound of his own blood moving in his ears, and nothing else for a moment that lasted longer than any moment had a right to. "We took him at 7:45 this morning," Holt said. His voice was even and informational, the voice of a man presenting a business case. He'd gone for a walk outside his hotel, early riser. Poor timing as it turned out. A pause. His fiancée thinks he's already at the church getting ready for photographs. She's probably wondering why he's not answering his texts. Duke had gone very still beside Mason. The other riders had stopped their engines. The road was quiet except for distant traffic and the thin desert wind. "There's a safety deposit box at Wells Fargo on Virginia Street," Holt continued. "Box 847. I'd like you to go get what's in it and bring it here." He lowered the tablet slightly. "Your son is alive. I'd like to keep it that way. This is not a complicated offer." Mason looked at Eleanor. She was looking at the tablet, at the image of a man she had spent 3 days with, whose father she had pulled into her crisis without warning or choice, whose child was still months away from existing. Her face was doing something complicated, something that had guilt and grief and resolve all moving through it at once, none of them able to establish full dominance. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, to Mason, not to Holt. "Don't be," Mason said. He looked back at Raymond Holt. "The bank opens at 9, he said. "Give me 20 minutes. Wells Fargo opened its doors at 9 o'clock with the muted efficiency of a Sunday morning operation, half-staffed and unhurried. The lobby was high-ceilinged and sun-filled, which seemed faintly insulting given the circumstances. A young woman at the customer service desk looked up when Mason and Eleanor came through the door, took in Eleanor's composure and Mason's presence, and the particular quality of the silence between them, and had the good professional instincts to ask only what they needed without asking anything else. "Safety deposit box, 847, under Walter Voss." Eleanor produced the key and signed the access log with a hand that was steadier than Mason expected. The clerk led them through the lobby and down a short corridor to the vault room, a space that smelled of temperature-controlled air, an old metal line floor to ceiling, with numbered doors behind which sat the private accumulated weight of other people's lives. Box 847 was in the third row. Eleanor unlocked it. She lifted it out herself, declining with a small motion the assistance Mason offered, and set it on the narrow examination table along the wall. She stood looking at it for a moment. Her hand rested on the lid. He understood what she was doing. He did not hurry her. She was saying something to Walter. Whatever it was private, and Mason looked at the wall and let her have it. Then she opened the box. Inside was a manila envelope sealed with Eleanor's name, written on the outside in the careful printing of a man who had always taken care with the things that mattered. She lifted it out with both hands. She looked at it for a long moment, Then she handed it to Mason. He opened it. The USB drive was small and black and unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd find in a drawer without remembering where it came from. Beneath it was a letter, 2 pages handwritten on yellow legal paper in the same careful printing as the envelope. Eleanor reached past him and took the letter. She read it standing in there in the vault room, and Mason watched her face change as she read, watched something break open behind her eyes and then reform into something else, something harder and quieter and altogether different from grief, though grief was part of it. When she finished, she folded the letter along its original creases and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she looked at Mason. He knew, she said. He knew they might find him before July 23rd. He wrote this 8 months ago. She looked down at the folded pages. He said he had left something with the FBI already, separate from this. He said this was in case things went wrong, and I needed to prove to someone who mattered that I was telling the truth. She paused. He said to find Agent Diana Marsh. He said she was the only one in the system he trusted completely. Mason held the USB drive. It weighed almost nothing, a piece of plastic and thin metal and stored information that had cost a man his life and a woman 5 months of running, and was now sitting in the palm of a retired welder from Carson City who had come to Nevada to stand outside a church. He looked at it. We need to copy it, he said. Eleanor looked at him. We give Holt something, he said, but not everything. He called Duke. Duke's voice came through calm and immediate. The plan took 45 seconds to explain and required a copy shop 2 blocks from the bank and a man who was already moving toward it on a Harley before Mason had finished the sentence. He and Eleanor stood in the vault room and waited. 9 minutes later, Duke's voice came back through the phone. Done, he said. Every file, every folder. Original is marked. Mason looked at Eleanor. She reached out and took the USB drive from his hand. She held it for a long moment, turning it over once, looking at it the way you look at something you have carried for a long time and are about to set down. Harold built this, she said. She meant Walter. She caught herself. Walter built this. He built it knowing he might not be there to use it. He built it for people he would never meet. She closed her hand around it. We don't give it away. We give them a copy, Mason said, and we keep the original. She looked at him. Raymond Holt is walking into this thinking he's already won, Mason said. Let him think it a little longer. She pressed the copy into his hand. Bring my boy home first, she said. He put it in his jacket pocket and walked back out into the Sunday morning. Holt was waiting where they had left him, which was to say exactly where he intended to be positioned, in the middle of a Reno street with 8 men around him and the leverage of a man's son on a tablet screen. He watched Mason cross the road toward him with the patience of someone who had never expected this to take long. Mason held out the USB drive. Holt looked at it. He took it and turned to the young man beside him with a laptop already open, who took the drive, inserted it, and began to scroll. His expression was professional and neutral. Holt watched the screen over his shoulder. 45 seconds passed. Then Holt smiled. It was a real smile, the first one Mason had seen on him, that reached all the way to his eyes. The satisfaction was genuine and absolute. The feeling of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has finally arrived at it. Everything's there, he said. He turned the laptop toward Mason so he could see the file directory, the nested folders and dated documents and transaction records that represented 15 years of Walter Voss's meticulous and costly work. Every transaction, every shell company, every account. He ejected the drive and held it between 2 fingers. Your husband was a thorough man, Mrs. Voss. Remarkable, really. Shame about the timing. Eleanor said nothing. Holt slipped the drive into his jacket pocket. He looked at Mason. Your son is at the old Pinnacle warehouse on Industrial Road, he said. East end of the building side door, it'll be unlocked. You'll find him in workable condition. He paused. I keep my word, Mr. Cole. In my experience, that's a rarer quality than most people acknowledge. He turned and walked to the nearest SUV. His men followed in an orderly sequence. Both vehicles left the street with the same controlled deliberateness with which they had entered it, and within a minute they were gone, absorbed into the city's Sunday morning traffic. Duke came up beside Mason. The street was quiet. He bought it, Duke said. It was not quite a question. He bought it, Mason said. He looked at Eleanor, who was standing very still on the sidewalk, with her hands clasped in front of her, watching the direction the SUVs had gone. Now we go get Ethan, Mason said, and then we finish what Walter started. He walked back to the bike. Duke was already on his already calling out the formation, already moving, because that was what Duke Harmon did. He moved because 30 years of being the man other men looked to had taught him that hesitation was its own kind of decision, and he had long since decided against it. 6 motorcycles pulled out onto the Sunday morning street and headed for Industrial Road. And somewhere in a warehouse on the east edge of Reno, A 40-year-old man who was supposed to be getting married in 2 hours sat with his hands bound and listened for the sound of his father coming. Industrial Road ran east from the city like an afterthought, a long straight stretch of cracked asphalt lined with chain-link fencing and corrugated metal, and the particular desolation of commercial spaces that had been built for a purpose and then outlived it. The warehouses out here had been part of Pinnacle Group's Nevada portfolio for years, acquired in the early wave of development money, and allowed to sit, which was not neglect, but strategy properties that existed on paper to receive transfers and generate depreciation, and had never needed to produce anything as inconvenient as actual commerce. The building at the east end was the largest, steel-framed concrete floor 60 feet to the roofline, with a loading dock on the south side that faced away from the road, and a side door near the northeast corner that, as Holt had said, had been left unlocked. Mason did not stop to appreciate the efficiency of this. He came off his bike before the engine fully died the way he had not moved in years, with a speed that lived somewhere below thought, and Duke was 2 steps behind him, and the side door went in with one kick because the frame was old and the rust had done most of the work already. The interior was vast and cold. Thin winter light came down from high windows that had lost most of their glass to time and weather. The floor was bare concrete with the ghosts of old machinery prints in the dust, dark rectangles where equipment had sat for years and been removed. The smell was metal and cold air and something faintly chemical underneath. And in the center of the floor, exactly as the warehouse's architect of misfortune had arranged a wooden chair, Ethan was in it. He had managed in the time since the tablet camera had recorded his face on the street to work his left wrist partially free of whatever they had used to bind him, which told Mason something about his son that he filed away for later. His head was down. When the door went in, it came up. He saw his father crossing the concrete floor toward him. He did not say anything. Neither did Mason. There is a category of moments in a life that language approaches but does not reach that exist in the body, rather than the mind and the hands and the chest and the particular quality of a breath released after being held too long. This was one of those moments. Mason covered the distance in a few long strides and dropped to one knee in front of the chair and got his hands on his son's wrists and worked the bindings loose. And when Ethan's hands came free, they went immediately to his father's shoulders and gripped there, not with the tentative care of someone who was unsure of his welcome, but with the force of someone who had been in a chair for 2 hours deciding what it would feel like to get out of it. Mason put his arms around his son. He felt Ethan's breathing against his shoulder ragged, and then steadying the particular way a person breathes when they have been holding themselves together by force of will and have finally found something solid enough to let go against. Duke stood at the door with his arms crossed and his back to the room and gave them whatever time they needed, which was the kind of grace that came from a man who had learned across 63 years of a life that had not always been gentle, that some things required a witness and some things required no witnesses at all. After a while, Mason pulled back and looked at his son's face. The left eye was bad. The cut along the jaw had stopped bleeding on its own, which was something. There was bruising along the right cheekbone and on the left side of the rib cage, which Mason located by the careful way Ethan was holding himself guarding the left side without quite acknowledging that he was doing it. Ribs, Mason asked. Maybe one, Ethan said. Breathing's fine. We're going to the hospital. We're going to my wedding. Ethan, what time is it? Mason checked. 9:48. Wedding starts at 11. Ethan put one hand on the back of the chair and pushed himself to his feet. He swayed once and then found his balance and stood there in the cold warehouse with his torn shirt and his battered face and his absolutely unambiguous intention. Vivian has been waiting for me since 7 this morning. She's been calling my phone for 2 hours. He looked at his father steadily. I did not sit in that chair for 2 hours so I could miss my own wedding. Help me to the bike. Mason looked at his son for a long moment. He thought about Anna. He thought about the particular quality of stubbornness that had made her the most maddening and most necessary person he had ever known, the way she pursued the things she had decided mattered, with a completeness that made argument feel not just futile but somehow beside the point. He had missed it for 24 years. He was not going to argue with it now. Duke, he said. Duke turned around. We need someone to call ahead to St. Michael's Cathedral. Tell the priest the groom is running approximately 30 minutes behind schedule and will explain everything in the confessional at a later date. Duke looked at Ethan. He took in the swollen eye and the torn shirt and the careful posture of a man managing a cracked rib. Then he took out his phone. On it, he said. They stopped at a gas station 2 miles from the warehouse because Ethan needed a clean shirt and Mason needed a few minutes to make a phone call, and because Duke had decided that a man should not get married in a shirt that had someone else's blood on the collar. The gas station had a small attached convenience store that sold, among other things, a rack of plain white t-shirts in plastic packaging, and a rack of button-down shirts in patterns that spoke to a buyer's optimism about the impulse purchase market. Ethan selected a white button-down in his approximate size, changed in the bathroom, and emerged looking like a man who had been in a minor altercation rather than a major one, which was an improvement. Mason stepped away from the bikes and called Vivian. She answered before the first ring had completed. "Ethan, where are you? I've been—" "It's Mason," he said. "Mason Cole, Ethan's father." A pause, then carefully, "Is he all right?" "He's all right. He's standing 15 feet from me. He wanted to call you himself, but I thought you'd want to hear from someone who could be objective." He paused. "He was delayed this morning. He's on his way to the church right now. He'll be there by 10:30. Another pause longer. When Vivian spoke again, her voice had changed. It was still controlled, but the control was working harder. "What happened?" "It's a long story," Mason said. "Ethan will tell you all of it, probably in a very organized and chronological way, because from what I've seen, he's that kind of person. The short version is that he's intact and he's coming, and he's very determined to marry you this morning." He could hear her breathing on the other end. "Mr. Cole," she said, "will you be there at the church?" He had not been intending to answer this question one way or another. He had been managing it by not asking it of himself directly. "If that's all right," he said. "Ethan wants you there," she said. "He wanted you there before any of this happened. He's just very bad at asking for things he isn't sure he deserves to want." Mason looked over at his son, who was standing by the bikes talking to Duke, gesturing with one hand in a way that suggested he was explaining something complicated and getting some resistance. "Yeah," Mason said. "I know something about that." He ended the call and walked back to the bikes. Ethan looked at him. "I called Vivian," Mason said. "I know, I watched you. She said you're bad at asking for things." Ethan's expression did something complicated. "She's not wrong." He looked at his father. Then he said simply, "I'm glad you came to Nevada." Mason nodded once. They got on the bikes. St. Michael's Cathedral stood on a corner in Midtown Reno, with the particular solidity of buildings that had been standing long enough to have become part of the landscape rather than merely occupying it. Its stone exterior had darkened with years, and its stained glass caught the winter sun and translated it into something warmer than what the day was actually offering. The parking lot to the south was full. A few guests who had arrived early were clustered near the front steps, and they turned at the sound of 6 motorcycle engines coming down the street. Mason could imagine from their perspective what this looked like. He had spent enough of his life watching people make quick calculations about what they were seeing to know that 6 Iron Wolf members arriving at a cathedral wedding on a Sunday morning was not a calculation that resolved easily in most minds. This was not something he could do anything about, and he had learned slowly and imperfectly over many years to extend to others the reasonable liberty of being wrong about him before they were given the opportunity to be right. They parked along the south side of the lot. Ethan was off his bike before Mason and moving toward the entrance with the particular momentum of a man who has endured a significant amount of mourning in order to arrive at this specific moment. Mason followed more slowly. The wedding coordinator, a small efficient woman with a headset and a clipboard, intercepted them at the side entrance with the expression of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have seen every variant of groom-related crisis and had developed a rapid assessment protocol for all of them. She looked at Ethan's face. She looked at Mason. She made a decision that Mason respected for its directness. "Father Donnelly has been briefed," she said. "We have the groom's room on the left. The bride is in the vestry, and she knows you're here." She looked at Ethan specifically. "You have 11 minutes. There's a first aid kit in the room." She turned and walked them inside without further elaboration. The groom's room was small and paneled in dark wood with a mirror along one wall and a coat rack and 2 chairs and a table with a water pitcher and a box of tissues that had clearly been placed there for a different kind of 11 minutes. Ethan sat in front of the mirror and looked at his face with the frank assessment of someone taking inventory. The Iron Wolf riders stayed outside. Duke remained at the door. Mason came in and sat in the other chair. They looked at each other in the mirror. "You should have let me come to you," Mason said. "Years ago, you shouldn't have had to be the one who sent the invitation." "No," Ethan said. "I should have called. I wanted to call." He was quiet a moment. "I was afraid you'd be relieved that I hadn't." Mason said nothing for a moment. "I was never relieved," he said finally. "Not a single day." Ethan looked at his own reflection. He touched the edge of the swollen eye, carefully mapping its dimensions. "I know that now," he said. "I think I've known it for a while. Knowing it and doing something about it are different things." "Yeah," Mason said. "I know something about that too." They sat in the small room with the water pitcher and the box of tissues, and outside the organ had started something quiet and preparatory, the sound of a church getting itself ready for what came next. In 11 years of Sunday morning rides across the Nevada desert, Mason had not set foot inside a church. He had not seen a reason to. He had conducted what passed for his spiritual life beside the road in the particular quality of early morning light on open country, which had seemed sufficient and had asked nothing of him in return. He looked at his son's face in the mirror and thought that he had not been paying enough attention to what was asked of him in general for a very long time. Someone knocked on the door. Duke opened it. On the other side stood a young woman with dark hair and calm eyes and a white dress that had been chosen with the particular deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and had the patience to find it. Her face was composed in the way that people's faces are composed when they have been frightened and have decided not to let the frightening thing have the last word. Vivian Hartwell looked at Ethan. She crossed to him in 3 steps and put her hands on either side of his face very gently, her thumbs at the edges of the damage, her eyes moving over him with the thorough attention of someone conducting a necessary inspection. "Tell me later," she said. "All of it," he agreed. She leaned in and pressed her forehead against his. She stayed there for a moment, the two of them, with their eyes closed and their foreheads touching, and Mason looked at the wall because it was the right thing to do. Then Vivian straightened and turned to Mason. She was 38, with the bearing of a woman who had made up her mind about most things and was comfortable with that. She looked at him the way people look at someone they have been hearing about for a long time and are finally seeing in person, taking inventory, checking the reality against the account. She put out her hand. He shook it. "I'm glad you're here," she said. It was plain and unornamented and true, the kind of sentence that did not need anything added to it. "Thank you for sending the invitation," he said. Something moved in her face. "That was Ethan's decision," she said. "I just told him that whatever he decided, he'd have to live with it, and that the things we regret most are usually the things we didn't do." She looked at her groom. "We should probably get married now." She left. Ethan stood up. He straightened his borrowed shirt. He looked in the mirror one more time, and whatever he saw there appeared to be sufficient because he turned away from it and toward the door. "Come on," he said to Mason. "Not as an invitation, as a statement of fact, the way you say something when it has already been decided and the decision feels right." Mason stood up. He followed his son out of the room and down the corridor and into the church. St. Michael's was full. 200 people or thereabouts in the pews on both sides turned when the doors at the back opened. Mason was aware of the attention and ignored it the way he always had, as a form of weather present, but not requiring response. He walked beside Ethan up the center aisle and did not look at the faces of people he did not know, and focused on the altar ahead and the priest waiting there with the patient, slightly warmed expression of a man who had been told something unusual was going to happen this morning and had decided to accommodate it gracefully. At the front of the aisle, Mason stood to Ethan's left. The leather cut on his back read Iron Wolf MC Nomad. He had worn it into 100 places where it had made people uncomfortable, and a few where it had made the difference between someone getting hurt and someone getting home. He wore it now because it was what he was, the way his hands and his shoulders and his 65 years of living were what he was, and his son had asked him to stand here, and he was going to stand here as himself or not at all. The organ shifted registers. The congregation rose. At the back of the church, Vivian Hartwell appeared. She walked alone, which Mason learned later had been her deliberate choice, because her father had died 4 years ago, and she had decided that the walk down the aisle was something she wanted to do under her own power, which seemed to him like exactly the right instinct. She moved with the measured pace of someone who was fully present in the moment she was in, not rushing it, not performing it, simply moving through it with her eyes on Ethan and everything else in its appropriate peripheral position. Ethan watched her come toward him with the expression of a man who was only peripherally aware that there were 200 other people in the room. Mason watched his son's face. He had looked at his son's face a handful of times in the past 40 years, with the full attention it deserved. He was doing it now. He was memorizing it the way Ethan's jaw set and then released, the way his left hand opened and closed once before going still, the particular quality of the expression that replaced all the others when Vivian reached the altar and took his hands. Mason looked at that face and understood with the clarity that sometimes comes very late what he had missed by being gone. Not the events, not the birthdays and the graduations and the ordinary Tuesdays. He had understood the loss of those for years. What he understood now, standing at the front of a church in Reno, with the November light coming through stained glass, was what it felt like to be present for the moment when your child becomes fully, irrevocably himself. The moment when you can see the whole of the person they have grown into and recognize that they did it mostly without you, and that it is a remarkable person, and that the remarkableness is theirs entirely. The priest began to speak. Mason looked at the altar and let the words come over him, and felt something break open in his chest that was not grief and was not exactly joy either, but was something that contained both of them, something he did not have a name for and was not going to try to name. He let it happen. When the priest said the words that ended it, and Ethan and Vivian completed what they had come here to complete, the church did what churches do. It filled with sound, and in the middle of it, Mason Cole stood at the front of the room with tears running down his face and did not wipe them away. Duke, seated in the first pew behind him, put a large hand briefly on his shoulder, said nothing, which was exactly right. The reception was held in the church hall, a long room with round tables and winter flowers, and the particular warmth of a space filled with people who were glad to be in it. Mason sat at a table near the back with Duke and two of the other Iron Wolf riders and ate whatever was put in front of him without fully registering what it was. At some point, June arrived, having driven up from the diner with Eleanor in the passenger seat, having apparently decided that this was a thing she was attending, which Mason had not asked her to do and did not need to question. Eleanor sat beside him and ate with the appetite of someone who had not been eating properly for 3 weeks and was correcting the oversight. She looked around the room with the alert, interested eyes of a woman who had survived enough to know that rooms full of people being glad were not to be taken lightly. The speeches happened. Mason listened without hearing most of them. Vivian's sister said something that made the room laugh and then made it quiet. A friend of Ethan's from his graduate school years spoke about the kind of person Ethan was at 25, which Mason received as information rather than knowledge. The account of a stranger's son who had made himself into someone he could respect without help. Then Ethan stood up. He spoke about Vivian with the directness of a man who had learned, probably at some cost, that the things you feel without saying them have a way of becoming the things you regret without resolving them. He said she was the most clear-minded person he had ever met. He said she had shown him by example that the difference between a life you're managing and a life you're actually living was smaller than he'd thought and harder than it looked. He said he was grateful every day, which was the kind of thing people said at weddings. But when Ethan said it, he said it the way you say something you have specifically and recently learned. Then he looked at Mason. He said, "My father is here today. Some of you know the shape of that sentence, what it means and what it has cost. I'm not going to explain it because some things explain themselves if you give them time." He paused. "I spent a long time being angry. I'm still working on it. But I'd rather work on it with him in the room than without him, which is a thing I didn't know until this week." Another pause. "Thanks for coming, Dad. And thanks for what you did this morning." He looked back at Vivian. "I'll explain that part later, I promise." The room laughed with the uncertain quality of a laugh that senses there is more beneath the sentence than is being shared. Mason looked at the table. Eleanor put her hand over his. Agent Marsh arrived at 20 minutes past 3. Mason saw her come in the side door of the hall, still in her work clothes. Steel gray hair, pulled back, eyes moving across the room until they found him. He had been expecting her. She had called him at 12:30 to confirm that she was coming, which had told him that what she needed to tell him required a face-to-face. He excused himself from the table and met her near the side exit where the noise of the room was reduced to a manageable register. She looked at him for a moment. The professional composure was intact, but something beneath it was doing work, something that had been doing work since before she arrived. 32 arrests, she said. First wave went in at 11 this morning. Holt was taken on Virginia Street 40 minutes after he left you. The server shutdown went through simultaneously, which collapsed the auction before it could complete. The assets were frozen within the hour. She paused. He walked straight into it. Every piece of the operation that he thought he understood, the timeline, the evidence chain, the points of leverage, all of it was built around his assumptions about what Walter Voss had and what we had. He assumed Walter's material was the primary evidence. He assumed we were still trying to build the case. Something moved in her face. "We closed the case 2 weeks ago. We were waiting for him." Mason looked at her steadily. "Walter's uploads. 23 months of encrypted files," she said. "Every week without fail, right up until the week before he died. We had everything. The USB drive was procedurally useful. It helps with the chain of custody, but it was not what broke the case." She met his eyes. "Your son's abduction this morning gave us grounds to move on the full network simultaneously rather than sequentially, which we had been waiting for. The timing, as terrible as it was operationally significant." Mason absorbed this. "Walter knew," he said. "He knew when he set up the safety deposit box that the USB wasn't the main event. The box was for Eleanor," Marsh said. "It was so she would have something tangible to hold when she went to the person she was going to have to trust. It was so she would have proof that Walter had planned for this, that she wasn't operating on grief and suspicion." She paused. He knew her. He knew she would need something she could hold in her hands. Mason thought about Eleanor winding the stopwatch every morning. He thought about a man who had known his wife well enough to know what she would need and had prepared for it from inside a situation that was already running out of time. He thought about what it meant to love someone that specifically. Marsh looked at him. "There's something else," she said. Here it was. He had felt it coming, the way you feel weather in the small change of pressure, in the quality of the silence around it. "Someone inside the Iron Wolf chapter provided Holt's team with information about your movements," she said, "specifically your departure time from the county road on Sunday morning and Eleanor's physical description." She held his eyes. "That individual made contact with our office yesterday evening and voluntarily disclosed their involvement. They are now cooperating fully with a formal investigation in exchange for participation in a witness protection program." Mason said nothing. "I can tell you that the individual is currently in federal protective custody," Marsh said. "I cannot tell you who it is. That information is sealed as part of the cooperation agreement." She paused. "I'm sorry, I know what that means for the people in that room." He looked at the side door of the hall through the glass panel of which he could see the reception continuing. Duke at the bar, two of the Iron Wolf riders at a table talking, men he had ridden with for years, men he trusted with things that required trust. One of them had sold his location to the people who had put his son in a chair in a warehouse. He stood with this. He did not try to do anything with it. He just stood with it because that was the only honest response to something that did not have a resolution. "Who else knows?" he asked. "You, me, and the federal agents on the case," Marsh said. "The chapter president has not been informed. That determination was made at the department level, not by me." Mason looked through the glass panel. Duke was laughing at something the bartender had said, the kind of laugh that lived in the chest and took up room. He was 63 years old, and he had done many things in his life that did not bear close examination, and he had also stood in a roadside diner in the middle of the night and put himself between an old woman and the men who wanted to take her, because it was the right thing, and he did not require more reason than that. He had not sold anything. Mason did not know who had. He understood, standing at the edge of his son's wedding reception, that he would probably never know, that the knowing was not available to him, that this was the shape of what had happened, and he was going to have to carry it that way, incomplete, with the edges unresolved, which was not a thing he would have chosen, and was the thing he had been given. He looked at Marsh. "Thank you," he said, "for coming here to tell me." She nodded. "Your son is all right. The people responsible for what happened to him are in custody, and the case that Walter Voss built from inside a company that was paying his salary with no protection and no guarantee and no certainty that anyone would ever find what he left is going to put men in federal prison for decades." She held his gaze. "I want you to understand what that required of him, what it required of both of them." She left. Mason stood at the side exit for a moment. Then he went back to his table. He did not tell Duke. He looked at Duke across the table and did not tell him. And Duke, who had the instincts of a man who had read rooms for 40 years, looked back at him and saw that something had changed in the quality of his silence and did not ask. This was the kind of thing the brotherhood was built on, knowing when to ask and when to let a man carry what he was carrying without adding the weight of explanation to it. Mason sat down beside Eleanor. Late in the afternoon, when the reception had quieted to the easy, unhurried rhythm of the last hours of a celebration, Vivian found Mason at the back of the hall. She was still in her dress, but she had taken off whatever shoes she had been wearing and was in her bare feet, which seemed right, which seemed like the kind of person she was. She sat beside him. "Ethan told me," she said. "Most of it. What happened this morning? The whole week." She was quiet for a moment. "He told me about the choice you made at the bank, what it cost you to walk in there." Mason looked at the room. "He told me we're naming the baby Walter Mason Cole," he said. "If it's a boy," she smiled. "I told Ethan I wanted to name him after two men who understood what it meant to do the right thing when it was the hardest available option." She looked at Mason directly. "Walter Voss I know from Eleanor. You I'm still learning." He nodded. "You'll have time," she said, "if you want it." He looked at his son across the room. Ethan, with his borrowed shirt and his swollen eye, talking to one of Vivian's cousins with the particular animated attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what the other person is saying, which was, Mason had come to understand simply who Ethan was. "I want it," Mason said. Vivian put her hand briefly on his arm. Then she went back to her husband. Eleanor was standing at the window of the hall when Mason came to find her. She had Harold's watch in her hands, Walter's watch. She still corrected herself, sometimes the old habit of a name she had used differently for 50 years. She was turning it in her fingers the way she always did, and her face in the window glass was reflected back in soft and pale duplicate, the face of a 73-year-old woman who had outlasted a great many things and was not finished. He stood beside her. After a while, she said, "Agent Marsh told me about Walter, about what he'd been doing, the uploads, all of it." She was quiet. "I knew he was careful. I didn't know he was that careful." She turned the watch over. He was protecting me, even from knowing too much, even from having to carry it. He knew you, Mason said. 50 years, she said. He knew what I could manage and what I couldn't. He knew I would run if I had to, but that I needed something to hold. She looked at the watch. He put it all in that box. The evidence and the letter and the watch. She paused. He left the watch in the box. Mason looked at her. I always thought I'd left the watch at home, she said. When I ran, I thought I'd forgotten it. I looked for it and couldn't find it. Something moved in her voice, something careful. He'd put it in the box with the letter 8 months before he died, so I would find it when I found everything else. So I would have it when I needed it. She opened the watch. The two small hands, which had been stopped at 3:17 since the morning of July 20th, had not moved in 5 months and 3 days across every examination Mason had made of the face. They were moving now. Both of them, the minute hand with its thin and patient arc, the hour hand settled toward mid-afternoon. Moving with the ordinary deliberateness of a watch that was working exactly as it had always worked, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if it had simply been waiting for the right moment to resume. Mason looked at the hands moving. He did not say anything. Eleanor did not say anything. There are explanations for things like this. Mechanisms jar loose. Temperature changes affect the movement of small metal parts. Things that appear to have stopped are sometimes simply waiting. These explanations were available and reasonable and probably correct. Eleanor closed the watch and held it against her chest, and whatever she believed about it was her own business, and Mason was not going to touch it. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in February, Mason Cole opened the garage. It was a single-story building on the east edge of Carson City, set back from the road behind a gravel lot, and a sign that he had painted himself over 2 weekends in December. The lettering was not elegant, but it was legible, and it was his, and it said what it meant to say. Second Wind Garage. He had spent the first 6 weeks building out the workspace. Bench press, 2 bays, a parts room, an alignment rack that he had sourced from a shop closing in Sparks, and transported on a flatbed with Duke and 2 other Iron Wolf members on a Saturday afternoon that had included lunch at a Mexican place on the highway and an argument about the best route back that was the kind of argument that has no stakes and serves its purpose entirely through the having of it. He had not left the Iron Wolf MC. He had talked to Duke about it in December, about what it would mean to step back, to put some distance between himself and the life he had been living for 25 years. And Duke had listened and said very little, and then said, the patch doesn't come off because you opened a garage. The patch comes off when you're ready to stop being what you are. Are you ready to stop being what you are? He had thought about this. No, he said. Then keep the patch, Duke said, and fix my carburetor. The shop had business. Slow and steady, which was the kind of business that built, rather than peaked, local people who had heard through the particular channel of small city information that the man at Second Wind did good work and did not overcharge and would tell you honestly what your vehicle needed rather than what was most profitable to perform. He had 3 regulars by the end of January. He had 6 by the middle of February. Iron Wolf members came by on Saturdays, which had become a thing that no one had specifically arranged, but that had happened and then continued happening because it was useful and because the coffee was good and because it gave Duke a place to be. On Saturday mornings, that wasn't the clubhouse, which he had confided in his roundabout way, was getting loud with younger members in a manner he found fatiguing. The question of who had talked to Holt's people lived in Mason's chest like the stopped watch had lived in Eleanor's, something he carried without resolution. He looked at the men who came through his shop on Saturdays, and he did not know. He suspected he would never know. He had decided across the 3 months of winter that not knowing was the weight he had been given in exchange for the things he had received, and that the exchange was on balance not a bad one. He thought about this less than he expected to. On Sundays, Ethan and Vivian came for dinner. This had been Vivian's suggestion, offered in the practical and direct manner of a woman who had decided that the relationship between her husband and his father was going to be built deliberately rather than accidentally, and that dinner was a workable mechanism for this. They sat at the kitchen table that Mason had bought secondhand in December and ate whatever Vivian made, which was always better than what he could have produced. And they talked about Ethan's work and Vivian's current project, a municipal park design in South Reno, and about the baby, which was moving now, and had opinions about its position that Vivian described with the dry humor of someone conducting a long negotiation with an unreasonable party. Walter Mason Cole was expected in April. Eleanor came to the shop most Thursday afternoons. She had moved to an apartment in Reno after the protective custody period ended in January, a small place 3 blocks from a library that she had joined immediately and a grocery store she approved of. She was testifying in the Pinnacle Group trial, which was proceeding through the federal system, with the methodical complexity of a case built on 15 years of meticulous documentation, and she had opinions about the lawyers and the process that she shared with Mason over coffee in the parts room with the particular precision of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching other people how to think clearly. June drove up from the diner on occasional weekends. This had not been discussed or defined, which suited both of them. It was slow and unhurried and asked nothing of either party beyond the showing up, which was, Mason had concluded, probably the right pace for two people who had arrived at their mid-60s carrying the specific histories they carried. Nora had sent him a text in January that read, and he had read it 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. "Hey, Uncle Mason, can you teach me to ride sometime?" He had shown it to Duke, who had said nothing, but had smiled in the way that men smile when something works out the way it was supposed to. On a Tuesday morning in February, Mason Cole opened the garage. The Nevada winter had softened overnight into something that was not yet spring, but was beginning to consider it, the air carrying the faint green suggestion of things that had been waiting underground for their moment. The sage on the hill behind the garage was still gray-brown with the cold, but at the base of the post along the fence, something had pushed up through the gravel, small and pale and completely indifferent to the odds. He put on coffee. He opened the bay doors and let the morning air into the space. He picked up a wrench. He did not think in that moment about Raymond Holt awaiting trial in federal custody or about the 31 other men and women whose names had appeared in Walter Voss's careful documentation and who were working their way through the federal system at the pace the federal system moved. He did not think about the unnamed person whose information had gone to the wrong side of this story and who was now in a program that would give them a life somewhere without a past. He did not think about these things because he had given them the time they required, and they had received it, and they lived where they lived now, in the country of things that had happened and could not be changed, which was a large country but had its borders. He thought about April. He thought about a boy who would carry 2 names forward into a future that none of the people those names belonged to would fully see. Walter, for a man who had built something careful and true inside a machine designed for dishonesty and who had trusted his wife to carry it to the people who needed it. Mason, for a man who had arrived at a roadside diner in a Nevada rainstorm with nothing but a wedding invitation he hadn't been sent, in a direction he wasn't sure of, and had found in the middle of someone else's emergency the thing he had lost so completely he had stopped believing it existed. He put the wrench to the engine in Bay 1. The garage filled with the sound of work being done. Outside, the February sun came up over the Nevada desert the way it always did, flat and clear, and without particular sentiment, illuminating everything equally, the sage and the gravel and the highway and the sign above the garage door that said what it said and meant it. He was 65 years old. He had a long time left, or he did not, which was true of everyone, and was not, he had decided, the most interesting question available. The most interesting question was what you built with the time you had. Walter Voss had answered it one way. Eleanor Voss was answering it still. Mason Cole picked up his tools and went to work.